Ready for a deep dive today? We're going deep into a story that's a mix of military history and some really fascinating personalities, raising questions about the very nature of war.
Sounds intriguing.
We're going to explore the Bomber Mafia, a group of U.S. Army Air Corps airmen who, they had a very different vision for World War II.
A vision that really revolved around technology, didn't it? Specifically, this idea of precision bombing. And we'll also dig into the very controversial reality of area bombing.
Our guide for this journey, Malcolm Gladwell's The Bomber Mafia. It's a captivating read, revealing how a revolutionary idea fueled by good intentions and cutting-edge tech could take such a dark turn.
And we'll unpack what caused that shift, looking at the individuals involved and the ripple effects of their choices and the way wars are fought, even today.
Let's rewind to before the U.S. even entered the war. World War I was a fresh wound, and there was this longing for a less savage way to fight.
Right, a desire for better wars, as some called it.
Enter Carl Norden, a brilliant, some might say eccentric Dutch inventor.
Norden was obsessed with solving a major problem: how to accurately drop bombs from a moving airplane.
Yeah, early aerial bombing, it was notoriously inaccurate, almost entirely a matter of luck, really.
Hit or miss, quite literally.
But Norden, he believed precision was possible even from thousands of feet up. This led him to create what many considered an engineering marvel, the Norden bombsight.
I think people today might not appreciate just how revolutionary this was. It wasn't just some simple aiming device. It was a complex analog computer, intricate enough that bombardiers needed 6 months of intense training to operate it.
It really embodied this hope, maybe even a naive hope, of fighting a war with surgical precision, minimizing collateral damage, reducing civilian casualties.
A noble goal, no doubt, but war, as we all know, rarely follows a script.
Absolutely. It's messy, unpredictable, and that's where things get complicated. The ideal of this technology clashing with the unpredictable realities of war. So while Norden was working on his bomb sight, there was another group of, they were ambitious young airmen at the Air Corps Tactical School in Maxwell Field, Alabama.
The Air Corps Tactical School,
Right.
A real breeding ground for new ideas.
Exactly. And these guys, they were sparking their own revolution in military thinking. They became known as the Bomber Mafia.
We have to remember that back then, the Air Force wasn't its own branch of the military. It was part of the Army, often seen as secondary to the ground forces.
So there was this clash of cultures, attention.
A big one. The airmen, they embraced technology in a way the traditional Army just didn't. They believed air power could fundamentally change how wars were fought. And at the core of their vision was this idea of precision bombing.
And their ideas, they were considered radical, almost heretical by the old guard, but then World War II breaks out and suddenly their ideas have a global stage.
And a major point of friction with their closest ally, the British.
This all comes to a head at the 1943 Casablanca Conference. It was a crucial meeting where the Allied leaders were hammering out the war strategy. And President Roosevelt, swayed by Churchill, he agrees to a major change.
A change that basically meant abandoning the American focus on precision bombing in favor of the British area bombing approach.
Talk about a blow to the Bomber Mafia. They dedicated themselves to this idea of precise, targeted attacks. And now they were facing a strategy that essentially meant carpet bombing enemy territory.
The British, having endured the Blitz themselves, they had their reasons. But for the Americans, it must have been a bitter pill to swallow.
So what exactly led the British down this path of area bombing? What was their rationale?
Well, there's a fascinating figure at the heart of it, someone who kind of defies the stereotype of a military strategist, Frederick Lindemann. Brilliant physicist, Churchill's closest advisor, and, to put it mildly, a bit of an odd character.
Lindemann, he firmly believed in the effectiveness of area bombing, particularly hitting German working-class housing.
His reasoning: break the enemy's morale by destroying their homes and cities. A brutal logic.
It's a stark contrast to the Bomber Mafia, who genuinely believed that technology could make war less destructive, more humane. Despite these very fundamental differences, the Americans were given a chance to prove that precision bombing could work.
Their proving ground: the skies over Europe. And there was one mission in particular that exposed the limitations of their dream in the harshest way imaginable.
The target was Schweinfurt, a German city with a crucial ball-bearing factory. The plan was ambitious: a daylight raid using the Norden bombsight to cripple German war production.
The reality on the ground, though, was much more complicated. Fierce resistance from German fighters, heavy cloud cover, and the inherent limitations of the Norden bombsight itself, they all played a role.
It was a disaster. Out of the 230 bombers that took off, only 184 made it back.
Staggering losses. And the raid itself was a failure. Later analysis showed the ball-bearing factory was barely damaged, and German war production continued almost uninterrupted.
It was a devastating blow, both strategically and for the very idea they believed in. The dream of precision bombing, it was starting to fall apart. Even its most ardent supporters had to confront the fact that it wasn't working as intended.
It makes you think, what happens to true believers when their deeply held convictions are challenged by reality?
Yeah.
Do they adapt, compromise, or double down on their beliefs?
That's a great question. And that's where the story shifts to the Pacific Theater, where a whole new set of challenges, a very different kind of war, awaited the bomber mafia.
And with the stakes higher than ever.
Absolutely. The objective was to cripple Japan's war machine and clear the path for a possible invasion of the mainland. But the logistical hurdles were immense.
Think about the vast distances, the notoriously unpredictable weather, and the limitations of the B-29 superfortress. A new bomber, yes, but one that was plagued with technical issues.
The initial bombing campaign was launched from bases in India and China, which was a logistical nightmare in itself. Flying over the Himalayas, what they called flying the hump, was incredibly dangerous.
To give you a sense of just how difficult this campaign was, there was one mission where 92 B-29s flew halfway across the world, and only a single bomb hit the intended target. Just one.
It really shows the determination or maybe even desperation of the American commanders at that point.
The lack of success, coupled with mounting losses, well, it forced a change. The focus shifted to the recently captured Mariana Islands, which were closer to Japan and offered a much more strategic launching point.
And this is where Haywood Hansell comes in. A dedicated believer in the bomber mafia's vision, he was tasked with leading the bombing campaign from the Marianas.
Armed with the B-29 Superfortress and, of course, the Norden bombsight.
He ran into a whole new set of problems, though. The weather over Japan, notoriously unpredictable, heavy cloud cover, and this powerful jet stream that really messed with the accuracy of high-altitude bombing.
It's almost ironic. Here they had this cutting-edge technology, but the very environment was working against them.
Even with the best tech available, Hansell couldn't replicate the precision he was so passionate about. It was a classic clash. Ideology versus reality. The dream of pinpoint bombing running headfirst into the turbulent skies over Japan.
And then comes a new, and frankly terrifying, weapon onto the scene, napalm.
And this is where things take a darker turn, raising serious questions about the means and ends of war.
A team of brilliant chemists at Harvard, led by Louis Pfizer, had developed this incredibly potent incendiary gel.
Imagine a sticky, burning goo that clung to everything and just burned with this ferocious intensity.
They even built these mock Japanese villages at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah to test it, subjected them to simulated bombing raids with napalm.
And the results were devastatingly effective. The fires just spread so quickly, engulfing everything. It was a terrifying display of destructive power.
This presented a real moral dilemma for the bomber mafia. They were struggling with the failures of precision bombing, and here was this weapon that essentially went against everything they stood for. Would they be tempted to use it?
That question, it would ultimately decide the fate of Haywood Hansell and the legacy of the bomber mafia. You can imagine the pressure Hansell was under. His superiors back in Washington, they were getting impatient. They'd invested a lot in these D-29s. They wanted to see results, and fast.
Absolutely. And Hansell, he was caught in this bind. On one hand, his unwavering belief in precision bombing. On the other, the brutal realities of war staring him in the face.
The jet stream, the cloud cover over Tokyo, the constant threat of enemy fighters, it was all against him.
It was.
And then you have Curtis LeMay, waiting in the wings. A man known to bend the rules, to push his men to the limit, to get results no matter what.
LeMay had already proved himself in Europe, leading bombing raids with this relentless determination. He was a pragmatist, understood the harsh realities of war, and he wasn't afraid of making tough choices.
LeMay saw napalm as the solution to Hansell's problems. Why bother with precision when you could just engulf entire cities in flames?
It must have been tempting, from a purely strategic point of view.
But for Hansell, it was a line he just wouldn't cross. He was a true believer, unwilling to compromise his principles, even when facing incredible odds.
And it cost him. In January 1945, Hansell is relieved of duty. LeMay takes over.
And that marked a very clear shift in strategy, away from precision toward brute force.
It did. LeMay didn't waste any time putting his vision into action. He scraps high-altitude precision bombing, instead low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raids.
He even stripped the B-29s of their defensive guns to make them lighter, faster.
He orders his crews to fly in these loose formations, less vulnerable to fighters, and fully embraces napalm as his primary weapon.
A far cry from the bomber mafia's doctrine.
Oh, absolutely. It was a complete shift, from surgical strikes to mass, indiscriminate destruction.
And the first target? Tokyo, March 9th, 1945. Over 300 B-29s loaded with napalm descend on the Japanese capital.
They flew low, under the radar, under the cover of darkness, and unleashed a firestorm of unimaginable ferocity.
The results were, well, devastating doesn't even cover it. Over 16 square miles of Tokyo reduced to ashes. An estimated 100,000 people killed, most of them civilians.
The single deadliest air raid in human history.
The world was horrified. The scale of destruction, it was unlike anything they'd ever seen.
Even Joseph Stilwell, the tough American general, even he was stunned by the aftermath. He later said to LeMay that he finally understood what air power could truly do.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The sheer destructive power at our fingertips.
It really is.
And it raised such profound ethical questions. Was this the kind of war America wanted to fight? Was this the legacy the bomber mafia wanted to leave behind?
These were questions that haunted Hansell, even years later in his retirement. He had envisioned a different kind of air war, one that minimized civilian casualties, one that was fought with some semblance of humanity.
But the reality of war, it proved to be far more complex, far more morally ambiguous than anyone could have anticipated. That dream of precision bombing, once so bright, so full of hope, it was consumed by the flames of Tokyo.
LeMay, though, he had a different perspective. He argued that the firebombing campaign was necessary to break Japan's will to fight, to avoid a bloody and costly invasion of the mainland.
He believed he was saving American lives, even if it meant the deaths of countless Japanese civilians.
A harsh logic, but one that made sense in the context of total war, where winning was everything.
It's a debate that continues today. Was LeMay a hero or a war criminal? Was the firebombing a necessary evil or an act of barbarity? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about war and the compromises made in the name of victory.
They do.
The legacy of the bomber mafia, it's complicated. They dreamt of a better way to wage war, but their vision was ultimately undone by the limits of technology, the unpredictable nature of war, and the rise of a more ruthless approach.
It's a cautionary tale, reminding us that even the best intentions can have terrible unintended consequences, that the pursuit of technological advancement without a moral compass can lead to devastating outcomes.
The firebombing campaign, it really highlights how warfare was evolving. Technology was giving us the power to inflict destruction on a scale that was previously unimaginable.
You see that even more dramatically with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just a few weeks later. It truly was a new and terrifying era.
But even amidst the ashes of Japan, there's this flicker of the bomber mafia's original dream that remains. LeMay's firebombing might have been the brutal reality of the war's final chapter, but the pursuit of precision didn't die out.
No, it didn't. In the following decades, we saw guided missiles, laser targeting systems, satellite-guided bombs, all pushing us closer to that ideal of pinpoint accuracy.
But the ethical dilemmas, those persisted. Even with these advancements, the fog of war remains. Mistakes happen, intelligence fails, civilians still get caught in the crossfire.
The story of the bomber mafia really underscores that tension between how far technology progresses and how fallible we humans are. It reminds us that we can't just outsource the moral complexities of war to machines.
It emphasizes the importance of human judgment, of ethical leadership, of sticking to your principles even in the face of impossible choices. So did LeMay win the battle, but Hansell win the war. What do you think?
That's a good question. LeMay did achieve a swift, decisive victory in the Pacific, but at a tremendous cost. Hansell's vision of a more humane way of fighting, even though it was thwarted during his time, it did in a way lay the groundwork for a future where precision could, maybe, lessen some of the horrors of war.
But that big question still lingers. Can we ever truly reconcile the destructive power of technology with our moral imperative to be humane?
It's a challenge, isn't it? Not just in warfare, but in every aspect of our tech-driven world. The bomber mafia story serves as a powerful reminder, a warning even. Progress without a conscience, it can have devastating consequences.
It really can. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this final thought. What role should technology play in shaping the future of warfare? How do we ensure that human values, ethics, compassion are always at the forefront, even in the midst of conflict?
It's a question worth grappling with, a challenge we all have to face as we navigate this increasingly complex world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about, maybe even spark some good conversation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep. The firebombing of Japanese cities, it really brings up these massive questions about the future of warfare. Technology was changing things so quickly, giving us this horrifying power to destroy like never before.
And you see that play out so tragically with the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki just weeks after the firebombing campaign. A whole new era full of terror had begun.
Yeah, it's sobering to think about. But even in the midst of all that destruction in Japan, a piece of that bomber mafia dream survived. While LeMay's firebombing might have been the brutal end of the war, the idea of precision in warfare, it didn't just vanish.
No, it didn't. Over the decades that followed, you saw the rise of guided missiles, laser targeting, satellite-guided bombs, all pushing towards that idea of pinpoint accuracy.
Makes you wonder, did they pick up where the bomber mafia left off in a way? But even with all that, those ethical challenges, they never really went away.
They didn't. Even with the most advanced weapons, the fog of war, that unpredictable chaos, it still exists. Mistakes happen, intelligence is wrong, and civilians, tragically, are still caught in the crossfire.
It's almost like this constant tension between how far technology takes us and how human, how flawed we still are.
Exactly. And the Bomber Mafia story really drives that point home. We can't just hand over the moral complexities of war to machines and wash our hands of it.
It's about human judgment, about leaders making ethical choices, about sticking to your principles even when things are incredibly tough. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts? Did LeMay win the battle, but Hansell win the war in the long run?
That's a tough one. I mean, LeMay, he definitely got a quick and decisive victory in the Pacific, but at what cost? Hansell's vision, this idea of fighting a more humane war, yeah, it was shut down during his time. But it did, in a way, lay the groundwork for a future where precision could, at least in theory, make war a little less horrifying.
It makes you think, right? But that really big question, that core question, it still hangs over us. Can we ever really balance the power we have to destroy with our basic human obligation to be humane?
It's a question we have to wrestle with, not just in war, but in every part of our lives in this tech-driven world. The Bomber Mafia story is a powerful reminder, maybe even a warning. Progress without a conscience, it can lead to some truly devastating outcomes.
It really can. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive. But before we go, we'll leave you with one final thought to consider. What should technology's role be in shaping the future of warfare? And how can we make sure that human values, ethics, compassion, those things remain at the center of our decisions, even when we're in the middle of conflict?
It's a question that deserves our attention, a challenge we all need to be part of as we try to make sense of this complicated world.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about, maybe even sparked a few good conversations. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.